First off, what made you go into journalism?
I was a freshman at Vanderbilt, and I had a scholarship and a loan and parent support, but it was very expensive, and so I needed the money. And so I applied for a job at the Tennessean my freshman year, and to have walking around money and that sort of thing, and I decided I liked it.
Awesome. Speaking of the Tennessean, tell me about your career there. I know you've worked there for many, many years.
Well, I started there when I was 17, which was unusual. I was the first person John Segenthaler hired. He had promoted somebody who had been the college campus reporter, a guy named John Hemphill. He went on to general assignment, and I was hired to take his place. He was a Vanderbilt Law School student at the time. And so I started covering college news, mostly campus news, speakers, and that sort of thing. And also the boards of trust, Peabody, Vanderbilt, and so on. And in the summer, I'd work the police beat on the weekend, sometime in general assignment. And over a period of time, I did about every reporting job there was at the Tennessean. I covered the city council, I covered the state legislature. I spent 7 years, as a education news editor, covering that. And it was during that time we had desegregation of Nashville schools, and that was an exciting time to be a reporter then. And then I had a fellowship, pardon me, to Harvard called the Nieman Fellowship for journalists, and in 77, 78 went up for that, and when I came back, they asked me to, first I was a Washington correspondent for a few months, went up and evaluated what they needed to do in the way of personnel and organization of our Washington bureau, and then I came back and started the suburban coverage for the Tennessean. The in-house name is Zones, and set up the zone operation, and then I became one of the city editors at the Tennessean. There were three, and I became one of them. And I was city editor when Gannett bought the Tennessean. And 3 years after that, in 1982, Gannett bought three newspapers in Mississippi, and one was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and they asked me to go down and be managing editor there, and then became the top editor there, and then got to transfer to Jackson, Tennessee, where I was the executive editor there, and then to Shreveport, Louisiana, and the editor, all Gannett papers. And so I was gone for 7 years, and then came when John Segenthaler moved up from editor to full-time publisher. I succeeded him as editor of the Tennessean, and retired in that job in 2004. So that's the short version.
Wow. What was your favorite city to work in? With all these
Nashville.
different things? Nashville?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I grew up here, and so that's part of it. And Nashville was a bigger city and more things going on, and I enjoyed it. And the paper was bigger too. I also enjoyed Jackson, Tennessee. Jackson, I had a preconceived notion that Jackson was just a gasoline stop between Nashville and Memphis, and my family and I really enjoyed our rather brief time in Jackson, but we liked Jackson, Tennessee. It was a much more progressive city than I imagined, and had a lot going on for it.
That's awesome. Covering all those different types of news stories, what was your favorite type of news story to write about?
Well, I enjoyed covering things that made a difference in people's lives, and the school desegregation was one. And I posed as a patient in a mental hospital for 30 days, and that's probably my most famous story, that series of stories. And it resulted in a lot of change at Central State Psychiatric Hospital, and that was good. And then covering politics, the Tennessean in those days covered politics and all the races more than any other newspaper in the state. And I mean, I covered not only statewide races, but I covered presidential races. I covered Gerald Ford, Bobby Kennedy, uh, George Wallace, Hubert Humphrey. And so, I got to go out and travel with those, and that was a real fun experience traveling with those. And I went to the Democratic Convention in '76 and covered it when Jimmy Carter was nominated. And so, politics was a fun beat.
That's really cool. Going back to the one where you went undercover as a patient, what kind of preparations did you have to take before you went to do that story?
You want the short version or the long version?
Whichever you want to say, sir.
Well, when I first went after the story, I went in to see John Sigenthaler, and I told him that's what I wanted to do, and he said, "No, you don't know enough about it, and why should we invest all this time?" So I had to go back and do some reporting, and I found out that a lot of the doctors were not licensed to practice medicine, and that there were lots of problems out there in the hospital that I documented to give John, so we knew ahead of time the kinds of things that we would get. But there was a debate whether I should try and get a job there, or impersonate no one, or go in and impersonate a patient. The ethics of going undercover have changed greatly since 1973-74 when that occurred. Today, I would not, as editor, I would not send anybody in undercover. But in those days, that was acceptable and ethical conduct by a journalist. And I found a Vanderbilt psychiatrist, and his name was Joe Fishbaum, and he had won a teaching award at Vanderbilt, and I had written a very brief story about him. So that's how I found his name. Went out to see him, and he told me a lot about the abuses out there. And he taught me how to get in, and we had some meetings. And the preparations were, the criteria for any good undercover operation is you want to be a passive observer. You do not want to cause things to happen, because that's out of the normal day-to-day operations. You want to just be where you can watch what happens without being a factor in it. Secondly, we wanted something where I wouldn't have any medication or that would affect my ability to observe. And third, something that was safe, or as safe as you could be there. And so Dr. Fishbein recommended that I have that I go in as wanting, having tried to commit suicide. And the reason we picked that was that they wouldn't turn you away, like they might for some other illnesses. Two, that the medication they would give you at most would be antidepressants, which were not harmful in terms of. And third, they would watch you, but you would be relatively safe. And so he trained me how to act depressed, which is very hard. That cliche of it takes more muscles to frown than it does to smile has its roots in truth. It is hard to spend an hour frowning or looking depressed. And he taught me how to do that, and taught me how to take tests. For example, the Rorschach test that he took, that he showed me and trained me on. Depressed people normally don't see color in figures. So he trained me to look at, when you look at those ink block looking things, to look at the overall shape and not at the shapes that were defined by color, like there might be a red here and a blue there that gave it two shapes, where it's tough to only look at one shape as if it were in black and white. And then secondly, he taught me how to take objective tests, where you get multiple choice answers or whatever, and he taught me how to not take them too well. He told me about a psychiatrist that was on trial, and they were trying to prove about whether he was competent to stand trial, and he took the test, and he answered all the questions 100% depressed, which nobody would, but that was because he was trained that way. So anyway, he taught me all of these things, and then we did research with his help and somebody else's help about what doctor I would see. And in those days, to get into Central State, if it was a voluntary admission, one doctor. If it was an involuntary admission, it took two doctors. And this was going to be an involuntary admission. And the two doctors that we picked a time when they were changing shifts at the end of the week on Friday afternoon, so people would be anxious to get home and they wouldn't. So I went in around 4:30 in the afternoon with closing time at 5 for this shift, and I could see one of two doctors. And one of the problems at the hospital is that you did not have to have a license to practice medicine to be a doctor. There was a loophole, and in all fairness, a lot of it had to do with that. In Germany, for example, to be a psychiatrist, you only had to take 1 year of medical school and 3 years of psychiatry. In this country, you have to take the full 3 years of medical school and get your MD before you can then specialize in psychiatry. Well, those people that came from Germany here would never get a job because they were not an MD, except in state-run hospitals of Tennessee. And so there was this loophole, and there were a couple of doctors who had their past linked to Nazi Germany, and to varying degrees. And there were doctors from other countries, but the two that I had a chance to see were both from Germany. One was a short guy who could not be intimidated. Another one was a great big guy who wore over-the-calf boots and clicked his heels. And he was, and one of them couldn't get citizenship in this country because of his ties there and was here on a visa. And so these were the people that were giving care, and there was, and so I prepared a different story for each one. One, the little guy, I would try to do a sob story, and the big guy I'd try and intimidate. And so I had a different long story for my interview, picked for each one, and I drew the big guy, and I had found out that he was very uncomfortable with patients who had hallucinations. And so I used that to my advantage to get in, and I told him I hear voices. And he had a goatee, and it started twitching when I mentioned, well, you hear voices? And I said, yes. And then he asked me two questions I hadn't been prepared for. He said, are they male or female? And I said, male. I just made that up. And are they inside you or outside you, these voices? And I said, well, they're kind of everywhere. Made that up too. But the rest of it I've been prepared for, and discussed how these voices told me that I was no good and to kill myself. And another reporter at the Tennessee, Alice Alexander, came along with me posing as my girlfriend, and she's the one who found me having tried to commit suicide with carbon monoxide that day, and that's why I was there. And so anyway, basically I talked my way into the hospital, and that's happened. Once I got in, I didn't do anything else. I just watched. I did what I had to do to go in, and told the readers what we did to get in, and then became the passive observer.
So what did you discover when you were there?
Half the doctors were not licensed to practice medicine. The normal patient load for a doctor at that time was about 28 that you could have currently acting. Their patient load was 200. The treatment was conducted mostly not during the 4 weeks I was there, or a month I was there, I saw a doctor twice, but each time it was in a group setting.